Hi everyone. In this video we're going to take a look at some possible ideas for black against the London system. So suppose white plays d4. Now there are two common moves here, knight to f6 or d5. Let's assume you're a d5 player and white enters the London with bishop to f4. So there are a lot of moves for black in this position. One possibility is to play c5 right away. That's a typical London move, and you can make it on move 2 and attack white's center. And you don't have to fear white capturing the pawn because it's very easy to recover the pawn and get a good position. So black can play knight c6, and that comes with the threat of pushing the pawn to e5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, and then capturing on c5. So for example, if white's a little lazy and he plays e3, then you can play e5, push the bishop back, take the pawn, and you have a great position. Good center, good development. So instead of e3, a little bit better would be knight to f3 to control e5, so that stops us from putting the pawn on e5. Well, that's okay. We can push the pawn more modestly to e6, and we're going to regain the pawn on the next move. There's no good way for white to protect it. Notice this knight is doing a good job protecting the b4 square, so the pawn can't come forward. So white could try something like e3, we can take the pawn, and it's about an equal position. So black has no trouble at all. All right, so we don't have to fear the pawn capture. So instead, what a white player would typically do is support the d4 pawn by pushing either the e pawn forward or the c pawn forward, which often transpose. Well, in that case, we'll play knight to c6, pressuring white's center further, and then maybe white completes the triangle here like he likes to do in the London. And then we'll play our other knight out. And now white has to make a decision. So let's recall, what are the ideal positions for his pieces that he's striving for? Well, white likes to get a knight on f3, a bishop on d3, and a knight on d2. But he should be very careful with the move order. Now, a beginning London system player may not know the nuances here or the theory and may make a mistake. It's considered to be an inaccuracy to play knight to f3. Now, it doesn't lose. It's an okay move, but it doesn't promise white any advantage at all, and it makes it very easy for black to equalize. The reason it allows black to equalize is because it allows this powerful move, queen to b6, attacking the b2 pawn. And in some lines, we are going to see the black queen can capture on b2 and attack the rook on a1. Now, if instead of playing knight to f3, white had chose to develop the other knight instead, then white doesn't have the problem of a trapped rook on the a1 square. Queen takes b2 would not trap the rook. So that's the reason knight to f3 is considered an inaccuracy. So here we will play queen to b6, and white has to decide what to do about the threat on b2. White really doesn't want to push the pawn because it creates some dark squared weaknesses here on the queen side. For example, black can take the pawn on d4, and if white recaptures this way, then that pawn becomes weak. And if white recaptures on d4 with the c pawn, then we still have all these dark squared weaknesses, and at some point the bishop on f8 is going to come to b4 with check, and black is going to play on those dark squares. So most players don't play b3. Instead, they protect the pawn with the queen. And there are two moves we'll look at, queen to c2 and queen to b3. Let's say white plays queen to b3 and opposes our queen. Well, here we're going to gain some space with c4 and get a tempo on the queen. Now, white doesn't really want to trade here and give us the open a file. It does double our pawns, but this pawn can often come forward to b4 and trade itself for this c3 pawn. And black has no trouble in this position. So instead, what white normally does is retreat the queen to c2, keeping an eye on the b2 pawn there. But then black has a really nice tactical resource that you should be aware of when you face the London, which is this nice move bishop to f5, which looks crazy because the bishop is just hanging, but black is attacking the queen, and the point is if white takes the bishop, then black takes on b2, and there's that trapped rook we talked about. And so white's going to drop that rook on the next move. Black will have a winning material advantage. So white doesn't take that bishop. Instead, he has to fall back somewhere, like maybe c1 to keep an eye on that pawn. But after that, black can just develop normally, like e6 and get the bishop out to e7, castle short. And black has a nice position with extra space on the queen side, and white's queen is misplaced. So black has no trouble at all in that position. So instead of putting the queen on b3 and allowing us that space-gaining tempo move, white can try queen to c2. Now there's a difference. Here, black cannot play bishop to f5. It doesn't lead to a good position. And the reason is white doesn't have to capture this time and allow this, and he doesn't have to retreat the queen either. Instead, he has this nice move, d takes c5, counterattacking black's queen. He didn't have that move in the other line with queen to b3 because we pushed the pawn, so there was no recapture after this. Okay, so that's the reason why after queen c2, bishop to f5 doesn't work out so well. It's because of this counterattack. Well, let's follow through with it. Let's see what happens. Well, the point is white's trying to decoy the black queen so it's no longer attacking b2. So for example, black can't take this pawn because then white just gets a free piece and black doesn't have a queen going to b2 anymore. And there's no other place to move the queen, here, here, or here. We can't move there, but here or here doesn't allow black to recapture on b2. So the best black has in this position is trading queens, and let's see what happens. Bishop takes c2, c takes b6, and now notice how black is down a pawn. So if black wants to recapture the pawn, he has to mess up his pawn structure like this. Then white can develop the knight and attack the bishop can fall back, and white's doing really well because of the better pawn structure, and white can also make use of this nice b5 square. He can drop a knight there or put the bishop there, and so white is to be preferred. All right, so that's why when you see queen to c2 to protect that b2 square, we're not going to play bishop to f5. Instead, I would recommend playing g6, and that would allow a bishop to f5 to occur. And we're just going to develop our pieces normally. We're going to put the bishop on g7, we're going to castle kingside, and so forth. So for example, knight b d2, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, castles, bishop f5, and so on. And here black is doing fine. Black has probably equalized. Okay, so queen to c2 is not really a threat either. So we covered all the possible ways to protect that, all the reasonable ways to protect that square, and they don't promise white really anything more than equality. So for that reason, queen to b6 is a good way to play against this knight to f3 move order. So that's why masters don't play knight to f3 in this position. They bring the other knight out to d2. Now here's the difference. This time, if black goes after that b2 pawn, the rook will not be trapped. So for example, if black plays queen to b6 here, then white can oppose the queen, and if black gains that space and drives the queen back to c2, then of course bishop to f5 isn't going to work. White's just going to take the bishop, and if black takes the b2 pawn, the rook's not trapped. The rook can just move away somewhere, maybe give up that pawn, or the queen can maybe even retreat and protect it and give up this pawn. So white's going to be up a piece. All right, so for that reason, after knight b d2, I don't think masters play queen to b6 here because it doesn't have that venom anymore. There's no real threat on b2. There's no trapped rook in the corner. So instead, we could just develop normally. We can put our bishop on f5, getting it outside of the pawn chain. And then there are a lot of things white can do here. For example, white can try queen to b3 and attack our pawn. Well, in that case, we can defend with queen to d7. Okay, and then maybe the knight comes out. We can still gain some space here and maybe drive the queen back and then do this. There's some cases where white will attack our bishop here and try to get the bishop pair, and it's okay to let him take it and get this kind of pawn structure, because these pawns do clamp down on the e4 square. And I know we have doubled pawns here, but the pawn on f5 can be protected with g6. So again, black doesn't really have much to worry about here, but I think white's doing a little bit better in this position than in the other positions with the other knight move order. Okay, so those are some ideas to be aware of for the black side of the London, especially if you play d5 against d4. Maybe we can look at some knight to f6 lines against the London instead in future videos. All right, thanks for watching.